Welcome to Banking on Cannabis. This is a podcast where we talk to the leaders shaping the cannabis industry. I'm your host, Terry Mendez, CEO of Safe Harbor. At Safe Harbor, we help operators raise capital, bank, operate, and grow. Today, we're joined by someone who sits at the center of those challenges, Julius. Let me see if I get this right. Ivan sits,
Yes.
the
Yeah,
Chief
thank you.
Financial Officer at Parallel. Parallel, a multi-state operator, diverse footprint, Florida, Texas, other places, strong consumer brand, a commitment to sustainable growth. Julius, you bring decades of financial expertise to this organization. It's an organization that I can say is committed to agility and making decisions that are accountable to the customer and the industry. We're proud that you're one of our clients and customers, and especially after we were able to step in and help you with the previous bank that left the space, right? And
Yeah.
decided to here's a check and please find another home. That's a tough place. We'll talk about that a little later. But our team helped you guys onboard really quick and mitigate the disruption of your business. Welcome, Julius, and I'm so glad to have you.
No, I'm happy to be here as well.
Appreciate it. So I'm going to jump right in if you don't mind.
No, go right.
So I want the audience to get to know you. You've been nearly 2 decades in core manufacturing and experience in finance. What led you to cannabis, and how's the journey been so far?
Cannabis is a very interesting place, right? This is actually my second stint in cannabis. So I was actually CFO at Hexo, Canada's largest cannabis company, worked there and turned around the business, leading the eventual sale to Tilray Brands, 2.5 years ago. I went into the beverage space and then kind of like, Godfather 3, I thought I was out and they pulled me back in. Because the thing about, cannabis is there's a whole host of challenges. When you wake up in the morning that you never know exactly what's going to happen, but the industry, the dynamics, the opportunity, and, people are so excited who work and love the flower. You don't see that in many other industries, the passion, and, you've got billion-dollar markets here that are just looking to professionalize, and, there's value and there's space for everybody to win, is an exciting opportunity. But the headwinds on regulation, legislation, it seems like every other day something new is coming up. And then how do you digest that? How do you pivot? Do you make a bet? Do you not make a bet? It's an interesting environment.
It's so incredibly dynamic. I've been in the space of restructuring for over 20 years, the last couple of years in the cannabis industry. And it's not a dull moment. I thought maybe after leaving public accounting and whatnot, I'd be closing the books, opening the books, not here. Here every day is a new opportunity to chase and a new, problem and challenge to solve. I know you guys have been through your, restructuring challenges the past few years. Perhaps tell the audience a little bit about Parallel, some of the things you've had to overcome since you jumped in.
Yeah, just a little bit about Parallel. So we are a multi-state operator with a footprint in Florida, Texas, and Massachusetts, 50 plus retail stores and, pickup locations in those 3 states. And then obviously, you have to make in the state to sell in the state. Parallel had the same challenges as many MSOs is, you had the business plan out there that all the revenue plans looked like they were shooting straight up. And then as legalization didn't happen with Parallel, the SPAC was canceled. Then you had the double black diamond slope on just expense structures being too high and revenue just not meeting those projections. And, Parallel's kind of coming out on the other side of this. We've made a lot of progress here in 2015, and we're very optimistic on our future with the organization that we've created.
Julius, one of the things that I used to tell people when I jumped into the cannabis industry is you really have to think about cost. And you were talking about cost as, rationalization is the term I use, but cost in the context of how many eights is it going to take to afford what you're trying to buy, and what's that return on capital. And when I started telling people, hey, hiring that individual, I get it saves you some time, but this is how many eights it costs to hire that individual, and what's the sales effort associated with it? And does it make sense? Are you going to get a return on your investment associated with that? And I'm assuming, just because the time of year, you're in the midst of your 2026 planning. I know forecasting in this space is challenging. You got volatility on pricing, regulatory uncertainty, shifting customer trends, a need to continuously innovate and deploy capital effectively. How are you leading those discussions with your teams? And what advice do you have to our audience and folks that are investing in cannabis on how to keep the organization focused on your CEO's priorities?
Yeah, great question. It's one of those things. You always know that your budget's going to be wrong by definition, right? You just want to have the guardrails to basically have an operating plan going forward. And cannabis makes it even that much more difficult. So, you had the new hemp, legislation come up. How do you plan for that when you're going through an operating process, right? The hemp ban won't take effect for a year. You don't know if it's going to go through. Will there be an exception or not? And so you just try to stay to it with your core. And as is the case in most MSOs, your capital structure isn't great. Your cash is limited. So you really have to basically focus on, your core and your adjacencies on where you want to go. And the operating principle that I always look at is, how do we get to be the most cost-effective, nimble organization out there? So whether that means is, say, from the back office, using AI, machine learning to take people out. On the production side, automation and packaging. If you can buy a piece of a capital equipment for $25,000 and you can move out or redeploy 5 FTEs that cost $200,000, those are fantastic paybacks. And so I really had the team focus in on what are really some paybacks. And then when you start talking to, on innovation, well, there's always a lot of great ideas that come out of innovation, but does it really move the needle, or am I adding complexity to the business? One example is we have a bag, right? So fantastic product called the Fix, feels great. We're looking at it to put it in a roller, but the roller is almost $1 million piece of capital. But the addressable market size for a roll-on bomb is only so big. And does that really fit within our core, right? So we view it as, we want good flower, we want good pre-rolls, and get some good oil and distillate. Is that really a core value a core segment that's going to move the needle? And that's how I try to keep the lines, in place, so we don't drift too far away on things that just won't have an impact, because, again, cash flow is key. And we need short-term wins given the environment and the headwinds that we're constantly in.
Fair enough. And you brought up a point I don't think people really think through effectively. When you're hiring, when you're thinking about a process within an organization, the first thing you should really be thinking about, in my opinion, and you brought it up, is, how do I automate?
Right.
Is it AI? Is it a chat box? Is it robotics process automation? Is it workflow management, where tools like Zapier are out there to do workflow management? Do I buy an expensive software? I've seen people, jump from QuickBooks to Sage or NetSuite. And I always scratch my head. You have a team that knows how to use QuickBooks. That's like driving a car. And now you ask them to fly an airplane. Right. And then you wonder why these things don't work. Right? Your team is built to drive a car, and now that you gave them an airplane to fly. And so I look at it and say, hey, automate first. Right. Remove the complexity out of the system as best you can, and then look at the location where the performance happens. Does it have to happen right next door to you? Can we nearshore this? Can I outsource it to someone that knows it better? Or do I have to go to, offshore situations where talent costs less? And a lot of the ways that we work through transformation is to ask those questions of every department in every section, not only corporate finance, but in sales, in operations, and delivery, et cetera. And I think it's great that you're bringing that up, because that's the core of a transformation process, to say, am I doing this the right way, and am I getting cheaper, faster, and better at what I do?
Well, we implemented this late summer, is, in chat box instead of people, for your basic question, what are your store hours? What's the location? You had all the other retailers kind of using that as well, whether, Saks or Neiman Marcus and so forth. The technology is there, but you just have to lift your head out on, not necessarily what are your cannabis competitors are doing, what's the best in class technology that's lowing fruit. And that took out, a bunch of costs and allowed us to redeploy some resources as well. And that's continuous, right? You have a short-term investment and it has really quick payback. And as you grow, you don't need to add those heads back. That expense is permanently exited from your infrastructure.
Yeah, the first time I've ever saw that, I was at a conference. Campbell Soup's technology officer was talking, and they had reprogrammed all of these little Alexa pods, and you can talk to the Alexa pod. Hey, Alexa, how many days of vacation do I have left this year? Or, what's the process of X, Y, and Z? And, when I took over at Safe Harbor, we only have one person in our HR department, because we're able now to, have people ask an AI solution what those policies are. It's very simple. And so those are new technologies that really change the dynamics, especially when you're dealing with a grow or trimmers or folks that, they just want an answer to their question and they don't want the complexity.
Yeah, I mean, look at the airlines. The airlines have done wonderful jobs just on their helplines for those basic questions without having to talk to a bot. And also, too, as you have a lot of folks nowadays, they don't want to talk to anybody, right? Unless it's absolutely
me included.
It's not absolutely necessary. And then, even something else as well is your technology in terms of the grow, say like growing, things to make sure that you're having the right fertilizer, the right soil temperature, just makes a world of difference. Because as I tell the team, given this industry, we have to win at the line of scrimmage, right? And that's about that extra inch, or kind of bring up the Eagles, right? The tush push or whatever you want to call it, right? It's about being just a little bit better in something, a little bit extra. It gives you extra biomass. That's extra weight. That gives you extra product that leverages your fixed costs, right? It's not all about scale. Scale in cannabis, all like left where people put up these massive grows, just grew to grow. And they're like, well, I have lower cost per gram. Yeah, but you're writing off all this inventory. That's cash out.
Your total cost is there.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so you've got those pivots, and obviously, the key is execution. You can't do everything at once, and really just giving a path of the organization on how they want to move forward.
And it de-risks, I think, as you automate and you implement these technologies, it de-risks some of the decisions that are typically found in a cannabis organization. I always thought it fascinating when, one of the companies I was working with went out and bought a very expensive Argus system for fertigation across multiples of rooms. And that Argus system, finance cost several $100,000 to implement and install and purchase. And then the person running the machine was a relatively low-level person, maybe an $18, $25 an hour person. And you sit down and say, hey, if they make one mistake, $500,000 of plants may or may not survive that mistake. And so if you, integrate technology that mitigates the chance of that person making a mistake, now that decision makes more and more sense. Of course, these people are horticulturalists or they have, experience, but you're putting them in front of a, very expensive piece of machinery and say, don't mess up.
Exactly.
Hey, when you're developing your financial plans, I know I do this, and, generally give some kind of ranges. Hey, I think I'm going to be between this point and this point within a range, right? Now, we just talked about, and you mentioned that Congress took aim at the hemp-derived THC products. There's a presumption that perhaps you have some exposure out in Texas for your business, but I also looked at the Good Blend brand and looks like you might be okay. What strategies are you considering, and how are you going to pivot with this new information? How do you think consumers are going to react, and how does that play into 2026 for you guys?
That's a lot right there. Can I kind of say that is, the whole key thing is, right, with 70% of my business coming out of Florida, I have to win in Florida. There's no question there. Massachusetts, really tough market on a whole host of reasons. Kind of view Massachusetts as more of a Hunger Games. Like that market's that's gonna need a couple more years. Like air exited, right? So that's a bit of share pickup for everybody. And you have a lot of providers, just moving product just to survive and make payroll. And hopefully that works itself out over the next 24 months. So there'll be minimum investments in Massachusetts. And then Texas, we've got to feed the baby, right? Is if you look at the marketplace size wise, outside of federal regulation, Texas is what's left, right? From a big marketplace. And so I do see what happened, recently. I view that as an upside for us. We don't have any exposure into hemp, but we do feel like that's going to drive our business, upwards. But at the same time, it's not that clear is you can do vapes in Texas, but they haven't defined the specifications.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go buy a filling machine when you don't exactly know what you're going to fill, right? So there's a lot of circle time on just trying to come up with a scenario on what you're going to do. And so the way that I kind of view like budgeting strategy is, you've got your base case, you've got your upside and downside, right? And whatever you're doing is you don't want to go all in all places because that's when you end up in some trouble. So, you find your core, you keep that going, you expand, and then you find the pockets like Texas where we'll make some investments in 26.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is just basic responsible investing.
Yes.
You go all in on something. I had a business I was working with that, bought a joint rolling machine and a fill machine that could do all sorts of crazy capacity. And the thought was, we can leverage that capacity, but there was no output for that machine. It's like, hey, where are you going to sell that? And if you're going to sell that output, you have to win on shelf space. And if you're going to win on shelf space, you need to have a marketing department that can do that, and an ability to, knock on those doors. And you got to put all that together in a budget that says this is what it takes to buy this, successfully use all that capacity. And then what are you hoping for? You're hoping for, if you build it, they will come, or do you know it's there already?
No, I think you have a great point there is like the expense just isn't in the piece of equipment. It's through the entire value stream, right? Your marketing, shelf space and so forth, where all of a sudden that investment got a lot more expensive.
Yeah, exactly.
And, it's the adage is, you can take a Chevy to drive from point A to point B. A Cadillac drives from point A to point B, but is that worth the incremental expense? And so, I just take a much more just conservative, approach versus if you build it, they will come.
100%. And I think every dispensary, every marketplace has their demographics that you have to be aware of. We were selling in New Mexico, for example, where the average cannabis user made under $55,000 a year. So you got to make sure that your investments don't necessarily cause you to price things outside of what your customers could afford.
Correct. Yeah, because I think too is to your point is you got to figure out who you are, and I think a lot of cannabis companies forget that this is a CPG business. At the end of the day, it's CPG, and so what value are you bringing to your customer? You're always going to have a segment of your customer base that they're value-based customers that they're just going to chase the next sale for an eighth along, right? They're going to do that. Well, with Parallel, we are Curaleaf, we are Trueleaf. We're not that size, but I'd much rather just niche and win. Again, let Pepsi, Coke fight it out. And I know this analogy doesn't work. I'm very happy being Dr. Pepper, and winning, or along those lines. And just for us trying to get an enhanced customer experience that folks come back, they know our retail associates, our bud tenders, there's a relationship. And they go there because they like that experience. And that's really what we're trying to focus.
Awesome, man. So your team called us, a few months back, pretty stressful situation. My understanding is that your bank was exiting the cannabis space. They gave you very little time to find a new home. I can't even imagine that stress. You're trying to make payroll. You're trying to pay bills. You got vendors yelling at you. Glad our team was able to deliver for you. But can you walk us through what happened?
Yeah. So, you guys did a great job for us.
Thank you.
We had a very short notice period that the risk department of the bank said, "Hey, we're exiting out of the cannabis space." Nothing had to do with Parallel. It was just an industry decision. And I can't remember exact the timing, but it was either 4 or 6 weeks, something like that, for the exit. And obviously, we have 50 plus bank accounts, right, just in Florida. And actually it might be 100. I can't remember exactly. Well, how do you manage all that just from the paperwork perspective? go through diligence on the oncoming bank. And it was a case of, how do I make payroll in 2 weeks? Not that I don't have funds, I can't have funds go out, right? Um,
Yeah.
and two is, and if you look also to the demographics, is you have a lot of retail and operation employees that are make hourly wages. Like they need to make, rent checks, parking,
Right.
like 1 to 2 days on a delay is a very, big deal. And so we partnered with you guys. You expedite us through the process. Obviously, I was getting calls or emails daily from my board. Hey, are we going to make it? We were actually talking to the previous provider, like,
Hmm.
what happens if we dropped at zero? Are you really going to abandon us? And so you guys were great on the onboarding. We got everything done. And yeah, we're really happy. So hence why I'm on this call with you guys today, just
Yeah,
rolling
that's
through
awesome,
with you
man.
guys and want to give you guys a
This is part of the reason I was so excited to join Safe Harbor is we're providing something that is over, more than a decade, committed to the space. We've been, built for cannabis. We're run by former operators and really, really want to see folks be successful in multiple levels, whether it's banking solutions, lending solutions, whether it's outsourced consulting, fractional solutions as well. And so I appreciate that you gave us a wonderful review, and appreciate that our teams came together and drove something of value for you. This is not easy, right? And you're seeing this. I've said this before and on other forums where about 20% of those banks that jump in and say we want to do this within 2 years decide we don't want to do this anymore. And the challenge there is, that you just get a check in the mail, or you get a notice in the mail. You have so much time. I
right.
personally had a med card here in Colorado, and an account that I had since I was 17 years old. They locked it up and gave me a short period of time to refinance my mortgage, find new homes for my 401k accounts and my bank account. So you want to be where people like cannabis, and it's cannabis friendly all the way. Appreciate that.
No problem.
When we get into like cost efficiencies and profitability, I know you've focused and we talked a little bit about cost rationalization, operational efficiencies. What leverage do you see as being kind of the low hanging fruit versus things that take a little more time to get to but are worth the effort?
Well, a lot of it too is I think you just need to look at your employee population, especially call it on the back office. Is everybody fully utilized, right? Does everybody have a full-time job? Now, with that being said, if you ask anybody, everyone, of course, has a full-time job. But as we all know, is if you have 3 things to do, you could stretch that for your day. Or if you got 12 things to do, it's amazing how quickly you can get those things done. And
Hmm.
a key, like a parallel, what I've done is to make sure that it's the concept of one throat to choke, that Terry has full accountability for this. It's not a little bit of Julius, not a little bit of Terry, not a little bit of Sally. And then you find the efficiencies, right? And you can take out, it speeds up the decision making. It's not, 14 people on a Teams call trying to make a decision, right? You get the necessary information and you have the ability to pivot quickly. That's actually not, that one's a little bit of work, but nothing, tremendous. Is when you start getting into wholesale departmental changes and responsibilities and start moving things around when you're shifting, say, from a market structure into more of a shared services structure, that gets a little bit complicated because people were used to working with a certain level of folks. It's like, wait, how am I supporting 2 markets now? I always work with this person. Well, not everything's comparable anymore. And that's really harder to get that change management out there.
I agree, and it's really important. And as I talk to people about transformation and change and how to move past just the low hanging fruit, to make sure that there are people at the board level and the executive level that are bought in. Cannabis is really unique in that as you start moving people's cheese around,
Right.
they call people. I've had folks call my chairman of the board saying, Terry's doing X and Y. And, I have this opinion about it. Not every organization. And when I worked in Arrow Electronics or Hitachi, nobody would call the chairman of our board with that
Right.
kind of question, right? And so having the board support saying, look, I hired Terry and he's doing the right things, and sorry, you're, appreciate your opinion, and let's like move through it. That adult in the room is always something very helpful as you're trying to make organizational changes. And then you brought up the psychology. I
Right.
feel like I've become a psychologist over the last couple of years where, hey, I built this and it needs to change. I might not be the right person to help change it if I'm the one that owned it and has a sense of ownership. Or maybe I have that vendor relationship and these guys that are working with me have been with me for 10, 12 years. And, now I can't pay them on time. I don't know how to handle that. Bringing someone else in that perhaps gives you a little bit of a shield through that is a helpful situation. So just levers to say, when should I do this myself versus, perhaps outsource it or bring someone in that doesn't have those personal relationships and just can make decisions.
Well, I think one thing too is just in the cannabis overall for employment, it tends to be a young industry, right? People aren't
Hmm.
that old. Well, with that being said, is if they came in during the go-go days, they were probably promoted rapidly. And they never necessarily knew what good looked like. All they knew is what they know. And then
Hmm.
my perspective on doing something different really challenges them. It's like, hey, we're not saying you can't get there, but this is how an effective, close process works. This is an effective S&OP process. This is how you run an IT department where the heart is always in the right place, but the execution tends to be lacking because the experience isn't there. And I saw that at Hexo. I saw that as well at Parallel. And then the key is that these aren't the suits coming in, but there is a way to run an efficient organization where it's not about the PowerPoint. It's not about the PowerPoint. It's about
Yeah.
like these are clear, defined processes that everyone understands. And if you can't articulate what you're doing very quickly and simply, it may be overcomplicated, right? And that's where you have to look on like, hey, should we do something a little bit?
Fair enough. Fair enough. Hey, from kind of 280E, hate to jump into 280E. Everybody talks about it, but you're the finance guy. You got some material uncertain tax positions. Many of the MSOs are sitting on multiples of millions of UTPs. It's keeping some capital at bay, right? Family offices, private equity, not really understanding how to read a cannabis P&L the same way they can read any other CPG company. How are you managing through that? And, what are your investors, what are your, board thinking about in terms of the opportunity of rescheduling and, how you manage kind of the uncertain tax positions of the past?
280, it's just complicated, right? It's almost like when, the industry was created, it would have been nice if cannabis had the same level playing field as every other company, right? And it
Hmm.
creates some gymnastics on where you're booking things. It makes it inefficient and it is what it is. And, there's a point like, okay, you can complain about it, but it's not going to change anytime
You
soon.
got to manage through it.
Yeah, manage through it. And then I think what you talked about as well from the tax liability that is keeping a lot of institutional investors back is it's billions of dollars in tax liabilities in the industry. I don't know, is the IRS really just going to let you walk away from that or push it aside? It's just a giant admiral on the industry on what happens next. And if anyone, I have no idea which way it's going to go. Is we just try to kind of just create like the best organization that we have and drive profitability and let that play out. Kind of the same thing with safe banking, right? Is it would be nice if my consumer could actually use a credit card, that I don't have debit terminals that kind of function like cash, but not really. And there's an ATM and all of that. It would be nice that if you could just have, normal transactions, but that's not where we are. And I've heard a host of, I've listened to lots of podcasts where people go off on this for 30 minutes. I'm like, well, I can't change that from where I sit and just make the best decisions that I can along the way.
Fair enough, and I've had similar thoughts. Federal illegal distribution. We're not the first industry to have this situation, right? Prohibition happened.
Right.
There are 10Ks and 10Qs you can pull off of Edgar to find what people did back in the day, and they were still public companies, which is interesting, right? They didn't kick Philip Morris off of the exchange during Prohibition, but you can see the strategies that were deployed if you do the research and you think about comparative industries. In addition, that these uncertain tax positions, though, I don't see them getting forgiven. I've not over 30 years seen the IRS say, I'm not going to collect what you owe me from the past. Maybe restructured, and there's mechanisms where you can go to the IRS for an offer of compromise,
Right.
and say, this is what I owe and this is what I think I can pay, and I can pay it over this period of time. And going through that offer of compromise is also a very technical, mea culpa.
Yes.
There are folks out there that are also, saying, hey, 280E's been, not legally applied to our organization, and fighting this in the courts. And I sure hope they win.
Right.
But, you're fighting the government, so you never really know where you're going to play that out. So again, manage through it.
Yeah.
Right. It's not changing. Manage through it. Look at how other people have solved these problems in other industries, and implement. And for those folks that are under $25 million in revenue, I know that's not your situation. There is 471C. There's an opportunity for people to do that. And for folks that are, building their empires and looking to do distribution, you still can write off startup costs. So until you become a distributor of a federally illegal Schedule 1 drug, you're not breaking any laws. So all the laws that apply, as long as your tax folks know the rules, should allow you to have some relief. But very hard to get around 280E once you're over that $25 million level.
Well, also look at this, the industry will consolidate just by definition, right? It is 280. Like, are you going to buy a company with a giant unknown tax liability, and do you need to take that on or not, right? So park aside from like the current valuations and everything else, that's just a big headache out there on, writing that check. Real tough to see.
Agreed, right? And you see a lot of asset deals because of that, as opposed to, full company deals and legacy, regulatory rules. I know in Arizona, you had to be a not-for-profit. So you have a bunch of not-for-profit companies that roll up into a holding company that takes the capital, and you sit back and say, this is all complexity because of how we wrote the rules. You guys deal with a bit of complexity. You got Florida that's, legal medically. You have a competition from the, Delta 8 folks. You have Massachusetts. So you have Texas, where I think you're doing a lot of delivery and that type of stuff.
Right.
And you mentioned before that each one of your markets are really operating under a different playbook because you have different approaches for that. Is there any commonality? Should I look at that as, there's three different businesses run three different ways? Or is there a common thread that holds it all together?
No, like from the go-to-market strategy, they're all completely different, right? You're not any of them the same. But where we're kind of come together, get the efficiencies is really that shared service concept. One finance accounting group, one supply chain group, one marketing group. And so you go region specific, think globally, but act locally. I think probably the best way to put it. But in terms of go-to-market, there are no similarities, right? If you look at Texas to get a medical card, okay, you really have to have an issue, right? In Florida, it's a little bit more lax where you can't sleep at night. You take an Ambien, okay, you can try cannabis. And then you've got Massachusetts split between rec and medical. And even too, when you look at Massachusetts, you have to have 2 licenses for each one. Inside the store, if I'm medical, I have to go to a different counter than rec. But for us, we have to staff both of those. So, and then if you go back to Texas, overnight storage is now approved. That's moving forward. But if you think about your shipping lanes, right? You place an order, you deliver to your customer. If they're not home, something happens. That's on the truck, goes all the way back, has to come back again. What if the customer wants a little bit more? Well, we only have what you order. So it doesn't allow for add-on sales. And Texas is just a very difficult market with prior regulations to do business. And that's opening back up. And then Texas with, kind of expanding, I think there's going to be some good things there. Now, hemp, what does that mean? I thought I read this, something like 7,000 smoke shops in Texas.
Wow.
Just, okay, that's a lot, right? And how does that now interact with medical when, intoxicating flower is taken away? But in Texas, I still can't sell flower. I can do gummies, I can do tinctures, I'll be able to do vapes, but where's the flower going to go? So then does that push that back to the illicit market, right? Again, it is lots and lots of variables out there.
Or the border markets, right? I had 2 dispensaries on the border in New Mexico, and people from Texas came in every day.
Right. Right. Well, a little longer drive if you're in Dallas, though, right?
100%. As you look ahead and we think about parallel and where you guys are going, and if we didn't cover a topic you wanted to talk about, where do you see yourselves, 3 to 5 years from now, and what's the hope for the organization?
Well, again, is like the focus here is just long-term sustainable growth, right? On things like on products that, that we can do and we do well, right? We want high quality flower. We want to give our customers strain variety. We want to give them MPD, limited product offerings, whether it's a chocolate or a certain, gummy flavor. And it's really just to, market ourselves as, as a premium kind of brand, and to make sure that we continue to give the best service levels with the best flower to our customers under a nimble operating cost structure. So with that, as some of these things open up, say, Texas expands, maybe Florida eventually goes rec in 2 to 3 years, is that we can basically have a structure where we can move pretty quickly to take advantage of those opportunities. As I said, I don't need to be Pepsi or Coke. I want to be a top 5 player in the industry and continue to drive the business.
Have you guys jumped into, allocating some budget to lobbyists or, influencing the congressional folks in the House and the Senate or whatnot? A lot of folks are. I'm speaking at an attached conference at Vegas in a couple of weeks. What is your view on, trying to reach out to your Congress people and influence change there?
We haven't done much. I believe, there was something a couple of years ago, but I believe some of the, your top 3 players are throwing around a lot of money for that. And just adding increments to that, I'm not sure really moves the needle. I live in Miami, and when we were on the ballot last year, some of the pro cannabis commercials, Terry, you and I can do a better commercial with our cell phone than what was on TV. And so it was just pretty poorly done. I remember one commercial, it said like, well, you have a better chance of being killed by a bear than someone on cannabis. I live in Miami. I've never seen a bear in Miami. So I don't, then the analogy just works. And just so it wasn't well done. And so hopefully that professionalizes a little bit and has a stronger message kind of going forward. But again, as I don't see as I spoke earlier, I'm about short-term ROI, right? I'm on investing in systems, processes, key people, CapEx, where I get a return for me to write checks for lobbying when I could see the payback could be 3 to 5 years away. We're just not, I just don't see this.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Julius, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. You just mentioned something, professionalizing the industry. I think that's why a lot of new talent you're seeing jump into the industry and really think about, hey, there's real money here. This is a $35 billion industry going to $76 billion from what I can tell, and by 2030. So a lot of growth there. I respect and appreciate that you brought your perspective on financial leadership to bear for our audience. I think it's exactly what our industry needs to hear. To everyone listening, I want to thank you for joining us on Banking on Cannabis. If you enjoyed today, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with your colleagues across the industry, and we're going to have more insightful conversations coming your way. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Banking on Cannabis.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you.